The Doll's Ghost by F. Marion Crawford. It was a terrible accident, and for one moment the splendid machinery of Cranston House got out of gear and stood still. The butler emerged from the retirement in which he spent his elegant leisure. Two grooms of the chambers appeared simultaneously from opposite directions. There were actually housemaids on the grand staircase, and those who remember the facts most exactly assert that Mrs. Pringle herself positively stood upon the landing. Mrs. Pringle was the housekeeper. As for the head nurse, the under nurse, and the nursery maid, their feelings cannot be described. The head nurse laid one hand upon the polished marble balustrade and stared stupidly before her. The under nurse stood rigid and pale, leaning against the polished marble wall, and the nursery maid collapsed and sat down upon the polished marble step just beyond the limits of the velvet carpet, and frankly burst into tears. The Lady Gwendolen Lancaster Douglas Scroop, youngest daughter of the 9th Duke of Cranston, and aged 6 years and 3 months, picked herself up quite alone, and sat down on the third step from the foot of the grand staircase in the Cranston house. "Oh!" ejaculated the butler, and he disappeared again. "Ah!" responded the grooms of the chambers, as they also went away. "It's only that doll," Mrs. Pringle was distinctly heard to say in a tone of contempt. The under-nurse heard her say it. Then the three nurses gathered round Lady Gwendolen and patted her and gave her unhealthy things out of their pockets, and hurried her out of Cranston House as fast as they could, lest it should be found out upstairs that they had allowed the Lady Gwendolen Lancaster Douglas Scroop to tumble down the grand staircase with her doll in her arms. And as the doll was badly broken, the nursery maid carried it with the pieces wrapped up in Lady Gwendolen's little cloak. It was not far to Hyde Park, and when they had reached a quiet place, they took means to find out that Lady Gwendolen had no bruises, for the carpet was very thick and soft, and there was thick stuff under it to make it softer. Lady Gwendolen Douglas Scroop sometimes yelled, but she never cried. It was because she had yelled that the nurse had allowed her to go downstairs alone with Nina, the doll, under one arm, while she steadied herself with her other hand on the balustrade and trod upon the polished marble steps beyond the edge of the carpet. So she had fallen, and Nina had come to grief. When the nurses were quite sure that she was not hurt, they unwrapped the doll and looked at her in turn. She had been a very beautiful doll, very large and fair and healthy, with real yellow hair and eyelids that would open and shut over very grown-up dark eyes. Moreover, when you moved her right arm up and down, she said, "Papa," and when you moved the left, she said, "Mama," very distinctly. "I heard her say Pa when she fell," said the under-nurse, who heard everything. "But she ought to have said Papa." "That's because her arm went up when she hit the step," said the head nurse. "She'll say the other Pa when I put it down again." "Pa," Nina said as her right arm was pushed down and speaking through her broken face. It was cracked right across, from the upper corner of the forehead with a hideous gash, through the nose and down to the little frilled collar of the pale green silk Mother Hubbard frock, and 2 little 3-cornered pieces of porcelain had fallen out. "I'm sure it's a wonder she can speak at all, being all smashed," said the under-nurse. "You'll have to take her to Mr. Puckler," said her superior. "It's not far, and you'd better go at once." Lady Gwendolen was occupied in digging a hole in the ground with the little spade and paid no attention to the nurses. "What are you doing?" inquired the nursery maid, looking on. "Nina's dead, and I'm digging her a grave," replied her ladyship thoughtfully. "Oh, she'll come to life again all right," said the nursery maid. The under-nurse wrapped Nina up again and departed. Fortunately, a kind soldier with very long legs and a very small cap happened to be there, and as he had nothing to do, he offered to see the under-nurse safely to Mr. Puckler's and back. Mr. Bernard Puckler and his little daughter lived in a little house in a little alley which led out off of a quiet little street not very far from Belgrave Square. He was the great doll doctor, and his extensive practice lay in the most aristocratic quarter. He mended dolls of all sizes and ages, boy dolls and girl dolls, baby dolls in long clothes, and grown-up dolls in fashionable gowns, talking dolls and dumb dolls, those that shut their eyes when they lay down, and those whose eyes had to be shut for them by means of a mysterious wire. His daughter Elsa was only just over 12 years old, but she was already very clever at mending dolls' clothes and doing their hair, which is harder than you might think, though the dolls sit quite still while it's being done. Mr. Puckler had originally been a German, but he had dissolved his nationality in the ocean of London many years ago, like a great many foreigners. He still had one or two German friends, however, who came on Saturday evenings and smoked with him and played piquet or scat with him for farthing points, and called him Herr Doctor, which seemed to please Mr. Puckler very much. He looked older than he was, for his beard was rather long and ragged, his hair was grizzled and thin, and he wore horn-rimmed spectacles. As for Elsa, she was a thin, pale child, very quiet and neat, with dark eyes and brown hair that was plaited down her back and tied with a bit of black ribbon. She mended the dolls' clothes and took the dolls back to their homes when they were quite strong again. The house was a little one, but too big for the two people who lived in it. There was a small sitting room on the street, and the workshop was at the back, and there were 3 rooms upstairs. But the father and daughter lived most of their time in the workshop, because they were generally at work, even in the evenings. Mr. Puckler laid Nina on the table and looked at her a long time, till the tears began to fill his eyes behind the horn-rimmed spectacles. He was a very susceptible man, and he often fell in love with the dolls he mended, and found it hard to part with them when they had smiled at him for a few days. They were real little people to him, with characters and thoughts and feelings of their own, and he was very tender with them all. But some attracted him especially from the first, and when they were brought to him maimed and injured, their state seemed so pitiful to him that the tears came easily. You must remember that he had lived among dolls during a great part of his life and understood them. "How do you know that they feel nothing?" he went on to say to Elsa. "You must be gentle with them. It costs nothing to be kind to these little beings, and perhaps it makes a difference to them." And Elsa understood him, because she was a child, and she knew that she was more to him than all the dolls. He fell in love with Nina at first sight, perhaps because her beautiful brown glass eyes were something like Elsa's own, and he loved Elsa first and best, with all his heart. And besides, it was a very sorrowful case. Nina had evidently not been long in the world, for her complexion was perfect, her hair was smooth where it should be smooth, and curly where it should be curly, and her silk clothes were perfectly new, but across her face was that frightful gash, like a saber cut, deep and shadowy within, but clean and sharp at the edges. When he tenderly pressed her head to close the gaping wound, the edges made a fine grating sound that was painful to hear, and the lids of the dark eyes quivered and trembled as though Nina were suffering dreadfully. "Poor Nina," he exclaimed sorrowfully, "but I shall not hurt you much, though you will take a long time to get strong." He always asked the names of the broken dolls when they were brought to him, and sometimes the people knew what the children called them and told him. He liked Nina for a name. Altogether and in every way she pleased him more than any doll he had seen for many years, and he felt drawn to her, and made up his mind to make her perfectly strong and sound, no matter how much labor it might cost him. Mr. Puckler worked patiently, a little at a time, and Elsa watched him. She could do nothing for poor Nina, whose clothes needed no mending. The longer the doll doctor worked, the more fond he became of the yellow hair and the beautiful brown glass eyes. He sometimes forgot all the other dolls that were waiting to be mended, lying side by side on a shelf, and sat for an hour gazing at Nina's face while he racked his ingenuity for some new invention by which to hide even the smallest trace of the terrible accident. She was wonderfully mended. Even he was obliged to admit that, but the scar was still visible to his keen eyes. A very fine line right across the face, downwards from right to left. Yet all the conditions had been most favorable for a cure, since the cement had set quite hard at the first attempt, and the weather had been fine and dry, which makes a great difference in a doll's hospital. At last he knew that he could do no more, and the undernurse had already come twice to see whether the job was finished, as she coarsely expressed it. "Nina is not quite strong yet," Mr. Puckler had answered each time, for he could not make up his mind to face the parting. And now he sat before the square deal table at which he worked, and Nina lay before him for the last time with a big brown paper box beside her. It stood there like her coffin, waiting for her, he thought. He must put her into it and lay tissue paper over her dear face, and then put on the lid. And at the thought of tying the string, his sight was dim with tears again. He was never to look into the glassy depths of the beautiful brown eyes any more, nor to hear the little wooden voice say Papa and Mama. It was a very painful moment. In the vain hope of gaining time before the separation, he took up the little sticky bottles of cement and glue and gum and color, looking at each one in turn and then at Nina's face. And all his small tools lay there neatly arranged in a row, but he knew that he could not use them again for Nina. She was quite strong at last, and in a country where there should be no cruel children to hurt her, she might live 100 years with only that almost imperceptible line across her face to tell of the fearful thing that had befallen her on the marble steps of Cranston House. Suddenly Mr. Puckler's heart was quite full, and he rose abruptly from his seat and turned away. "Elsa," he said unsteadily, "you must do it for me. I cannot bear to see her go into the box." So he went and stood at the window with his back turned while Elsa did what he had not the heart to do. "Is it done?" he asked, not turning round. "Then take her away, my dear. Put on your hat and take her to Cranston House quickly, and when you are gone I will turn round." Elsa was used to her father's queer ways with the dolls, and though she had never seen him so much moved by a parting, she was not much surprised. "Come back quickly," he said when he heard her hand on the latch. "It's growing late, and I should not send you at this hour, but I cannot bear to look forward to it any more." When Elsa was gone, he left the window and sat down in his place before the table again, to wait for the child to come back. He touched the place where Nina had lain very gently, and he recalled the softly tinted pink face and the glass eyes and the ringlets of yellow hair till he could almost see them. The evenings were long, for it was late in the spring, but it began to grow dark soon, and Mr. Puckler wondered why Elsa did not come back. She had been gone an hour and a half, and that was much longer than he had expected, for it was barely a half-mile from Belgrave Square to Cranston House. He reflected that the child might have been kept waiting, but as the twilight deepened he grew anxious and walked up and down the dim workshop, no longer thinking of Nina, but of Elsa, his own living child whom he loved. An undefinable, disquieting sensation came upon him by fine degrees, a chilliness and a faint stirring of his thin hair, joined with a wish to be in any company rather than to be alone much longer. It was the beginning of fear. He told himself in strong German English that he was a foolish old man, and he began to feel about for the matches in the dusk. He knew just where they should be, for he always kept them in the same place, close to the little tin box that held bits of sealing wax of various colors for some kinds of mending, but somehow he could not find the matches in the gloom. Something had happened to Elsa, he was sure, and his fear increased. He felt as though it might be allayed if he could get a light and see what time it was. Then he called himself a foolish old man again, and the sound of his own voice startled him in the dark. He could not find the matches. The window was gray still. He might see what time it was if he went close to it, and he could go get the matches out of the cupboard afterwards. He stood back from the table to get out of the way of the chair and began to cross the board floor. Something was following him in the dark. There was a small pattering, as of tiny feet upon the boards. He stopped and listened, and the roots of his hair tingled. It was nothing, and he was a foolish old man. He made 2 steps more, and he was sure that he heard the little pattering again. He turned his back to the window, leaning against the sash so that the panes began to crack, and he faced the dark. Everything was quite still, and it smelt of paste and cement and wood filings as usual. "Is that you, Elsa?" he asked, and he was surprised by the fear in his voice. There was no answer in the room, and he held up his watch and tried to make out what time it was by the gray dusk that was just not darkness. So far as he could see, it was within 2 or 3 minutes of 10 o'clock. He had been a long time alone. He was shocked and frightened for Elsa, out in London so late, and he almost ran across the room to the door. As he fumbled for the latch, he distinctly heard the running of little feet after him. "Mice!" he exclaimed feebly, just as he got the door open. He shut it quickly behind him and felt as though some cold thing had settled on his back and were writhing upon him. The passage was quite dark, but he found his hat and was out in the alley in a moment, breathing more freely and surprised to find how much light there still was in the open air. He could see the pavement clearly under his feet, and far off in the street to which the alley led, he could hear the laughter and calls of children playing some game out of doors. He wondered how he could have been so nervous, and for an instant he thought of going back into the house to wait quietly for Elsa. But instantly he felt that nervous fright of something stealing over him again. In any case, it was better to walk up to Cranston House and ask the servants about the child. One of the women had perhaps taken a fancy to her and was even now giving her tea and cake. He walked quickly to Belgrave Square and then up the broad streets, listening as he went, whenever there was no other sound, for the tiny footsteps. But he heard nothing and was laughing at himself when he rang the servant's bell at the big house. Of course the child must be there. The person who opened the door was quite an inferior person, for it was a back door, but affected the manners of the front, and stared at Mr. Puckler suspiciously under the strong light. No little girl had been seen, and he knew nothing about no dolls. "She is my little girl," said Mr. Puckler tremulously, for all his anxiety was returning tenfold, "and I'm afraid something has happened." The inferior person said rudely that nothing could have happened to her in that house because she had not been there, which was a jolly good reason why, and Mr. Puckler was obliged to admit that the man ought to know, as it was his business to keep the door and let people in. He wished to be allowed to speak to the under-nurse, who knew him, but the man was ruder than ever and finally shut the door in his face. When the dull doctor was alone in the street, he steadied himself by the railing, for he felt as though he were breaking in two, just as some dolls break, in the middle of the backbone. Presently he knew that he must be doing something to find Elsa, and that gave him strength. He began to walk as quickly as he could through the streets, following every highway and byway which his little girl might have taken on her errand. He also asked several policemen in vain if they had seen her, and most of them answered him kindly, for they saw that he was a sober man and in his right senses, and some of them had little girls of their own. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when he went up to his own door again, worn out and hopeless and broken-hearted. As he turned the key in the lock, his heart stood still, for he knew that he was awake and not dreaming, and that he really heard those tiny footsteps pattering to meet him inside the house along the passage. But he was too unhappy to be much frightened any more, and his heart went on again with a dull, regular pain that found its way all through him with every pulse. So he went in and hung up his hat in the dark, and found the matches in the cupboard and the candlestick in its place in the corner. Mr. Puckler was so much overcome and so completely worn out that he sat down in his chair before the work table and almost fainted as his face dropped forward upon his folded hands. Beside him the solitary candle burned steadily with a low flame in the still warm air. "Elsa, Elsa," he moaned against his yellow knuckles, and that was all he could say, and it was no relief to him. On the contrary, the very sound of the name was a new and sharp pain that pierced his ears and his head and his very soul, for every time he repeated the name it meant that little Elsa was dead somewhere out in the streets of London in the dark. He was so terribly hurt that he did not even feel something pulling gently at the skirt of his old coat, so gently that it was like the nibbling of a tiny mouse. He might have thought that it was really a mouse if he had noticed it. "Elsa! Elsa!" he groaned right against his hands. Then a cool breath stirred his thin hair, and the low flame of the one candle dropped down almost to a mere spark, not flickering as though a draft were going to blow it out, but just dropping down as if it were tired out. Mr. Puckler felt his hands stiffening with fright under his face, and there was a faint rustling sound, like some small silk thing blown in a gentle breeze. He sat up straight, stark and scared, and a small wooden voice spoke in the stillness. "Papa?" it said with a break between the syllables. Mr. Puckler stood up in a single jump. His chair fell over backwards with a smashing noise upon the wooden floor. The candle had almost gone out. It was Nina's doll's voice that had spoken, and he should have known it among the voices of 100 other dolls. And yet there was something more in it, a little human ring, with a pitiful cry and a call for help, and the wail of a hurt child. Mr. Puckler stood up, stark and stiff, and tried to look around, but at first he could not, for he seemed to be frozen from head to foot. Then he made a great effort, and he raised one hand to each of his temples, and pressed his own head round as he would have turned a doll's. The candle was burning so low that it might as well have been out altogether, for any light it gave, and the room seemed quite dark at first. Then he saw something. He would not have believed that he could be more frightened than he had been just before that, but he was, and his knees shook, for he saw the doll standing in the middle of the floor, shining with a faint and ghostly radiance, her beautiful glassy brown eyes fixed on his, and across her face the very thin line of the break he had mended shone as though it were drawn in light with the fine point of a white flame. Yet there was something more in the eyes, too. There was something human, like Elsa's own, but as if only the doll saw him through them and not Elsa. And there was enough of Elsa to bring back all his pain and make him forget his fear. "Elsa, my little Elsa!" he cried aloud. The small ghost moved, and its doll arm slowly rose and fell with a stiff mechanical motion. "Papa?" it said. It seemed this time there was even more of Elsa's tone echoing somewhere between the wooden notes that reached his ears so distinctly, and yet so far away. Elsa was calling him, he was sure. His face was perfectly white in the gloom, but his knees did not shake any more, and he felt that he was less frightened. "Yes, child, but where, he asked. "Where are you, Elsa?" Papa? The syllables died away in the quiet room. There was a low rustling of silk. The glassy brown eyes turned slowly away, and Mr. Puckler heard the pitter-patter of small feet in the bronze kid slippers as the figure ran straight to the door. The candle burned high again. The room was full of light, and he was alone. Mr. Puckler passed his hand over his eyes and looked about him. He could see everything quite clearly, and he felt that he must have been dreaming, though he was standing instead of sitting down, as he should have been if he had just waked up. The candle burned brightly now. There were the dolls to be mended, lying in a row with their toes up. The third one had lost her right shoe, and Elsa was making one. He knew that, and he was certainly not dreaming now. He had not been dreaming when he had come in from his fruitless search and heard the doll's footsteps running to the door. He had not fallen asleep in his chair. How could he possibly have fallen asleep when his heart was breaking? He had been awake all the time. He steadied himself, set the fallen chair upon its legs, and said to himself again very emphatically that he was a foolish old man. He ought to be out in the streets looking for his child, asking questions, and inquiring at the police stations, where all accidents were reported as soon as they were known, or at the hospitals. Papa? The longing, wailing, pitiful little wooden cry rang from the passage outside the door, and Mr. Puckler stood for an instant with white face, transfixed and rooted to the spot. A moment later his hand was on the latch, and he was in the passage with the light streaming from the open door behind him. Quite at the other end he saw the little phantom shining clearly in the shadow, and the right hand seemed to beckon to him as the arm rose and fell once more. He knew all at once it had not come to frighten him but to lead him, and when it disappeared and he walked boldly toward the door, he knew that it was in the street outside waiting for him. He forgot that he was tired and had eaten no supper and had walked many miles, for a sudden hope ran through and through him like a golden stream of life. And sure enough, at the corner of the alley and at the corner of the street and out in Belgrave Square, he saw the small ghost flitting before him. Sometimes it was only a shadow where there was other light, but then the glare of the lamps made a pale green sheen on the little Mother Hubbard frock of silk, and sometimes where the streets were dark and silent, the whole figure shone out brightly, with its yellow curls and rosy neck. It seemed to trot along like a tiny child, and Mr. Puckler could almost hear the pattering of the bronze kid slippers on the pavement as it ran. But it went very fast, and he could only just keep up with it, tearing along with his hat on the back of his head and his thin hair blown by the night breeze, and his horn-rimmed spectacles firmly set upon his broad nose. On and on he went, and he had no idea where he was. He did not even care, for he knew certainly that he was going the right way. Then at last, in a wide, quiet street, he was standing before a big, sober-looking door that had 2 lamps on each side of it and a polished brass bell handle which he pulled. And just inside, when the door was opened, in the bright light, there was a little shadow and the pale green sheen of the little silk dress, and once more the small cry came to his ears, less pitiful, more longing. Papa! The shadow turned suddenly bright, and out of the brightness the beautiful brown glass eyes were turned up happily to his, while the rosy mouth smiled so divinely that the phantom doll looked almost like a little angel just then. "A little girl was brought in soon after 10 o'clock, said the quiet voice of the hospital doorkeeper. "I think they thought she was only stunned. She was holding a big brown paper box against her, and they could not get it out of her arms. She had a long plait of brown hair that hung down as they carried her." "She's my little girl," said Mr. Puckler, but he hardly heard his own voice. He leaned over Elsa's face in the gentle light of the children's ward, and when he had stood there for a minute, the beautiful brown eyes opened, and looked up to his. "Papa," cried Elsa softly, "I knew you would come." Then Mr. Puckler did not know what he did or said for a moment, and what he felt was worth all the fear and terror and despair that had almost killed him that night. But by and by, Elsa was telling her story, and the nurse let her speak, for there were only 2 other children in the room who were getting well and were sound asleep. "They were big boys with bad faces," said Elsa, "and they tried to get Nina away from me, but I held on and fought as well as I could till one of them hit me with something, and I don't remember any more, for I tumbled down, and I suppose the boys ran away, and somebody found me there, but I'm afraid Nina is all smashed." "Here is the box," said the nurse. "We could not take it out of her arms till she came to herself. Should you like to see if the doll is broken?" And she undid the string cleverly, but Nina was all smashed to pieces. Only the gentle light of the children's ward made a pale green sheen in the folds of the little Mother Hubbard frock.
A strange psychological story of the power of the human mind. The Dream of Death by Elwood F. Pierce. The queer figure of a man sat deep in a chair in full repose. His eyes, usually sharp, were now listless and just a little sleepy as he watched the crackling fire. He felt a chilly draft at his back, and immediately there was a click of a door closing softly, after which feet shuffled across the floor. Unconsciously, Anderson Brenton, psychologist, sucked at his empty pipe. The intruder moved to the log fire, holding his shaking hands to the blaze, and shiveringly seated himself on a stool Professor Brenton had been using as a footrest. The man who thus for a moment had startled Brenton was the half-witted brother of his landlady. 2 nights before, the little psychologist had rented the room on the 3rd floor front, and as he bargained with Mrs. Thompson, he noticed the actions of the demented one. The landlady had said her brother was harmless, and Brenton did not give him a thought. "What are you doing there?" the lodger asked sharply, now that the brief cessation of fright had passed. "I thought it was understood that I was not to be disturbed. What do you want?" The psychologist's brows were shaggy, and so was his beard. He was a shaggy person, and being small, impressed one as a weakling physically. But his eyes were penetrating, combative, and he eyed his visitor fiercely. There was something utterly repulsive about the man who trembled in front of the fire. "Cold," the half-wit murmured. He shivered and turned anew to the blaze. "Cold." His body was shaking. Professor Brenton, contributor to the cause of science, might have found it hard to explain why he was occupying the 3rd floor front room. Perhaps it was because once in a while he liked to get away from daily college and to pursue certain of his studies uninterrupted. The room on the 3rd floor had been advertised for rent, and he had taken it. That was all. Almost immediately he recognized in Gus Aker an interesting subject, but until the moment the old man shuffled into his room and complained of the cold, it had not occurred to the psychologist to attempt a mental investigation. But this was the beginning. Brenton noticed the apparent harmlessness of the man and was interested. Then, casting into the half-wit's mind with questions that served as primary experiments, he became fascinated. Later, his tests were tedious and delicate, affording him an opportunity of determining the worth of certain theories he recently had developed, theories that were disputed by his scientific associates. Perhaps from a humane standpoint, Brenton was a bit cruel, but his examinations at least were in the spirit of the botanist who studies a rare flower. The psychologist learned that the man's intellect, unable to hold anything of itself, was keenly awake to the working of the minds of others. He found that virtually without effort he could transfer his thoughts to the witless creature, and the man would respond in a manner all but normal, as if the thoughts were his own. But no thought was retained. Gus Aker's mind reached out and fed on the intelligence of others, but the moment the thought had been transformed into action, he again became an imbecile with blankness of mind equal to that of a cleanly wiped slate. Of one thing Professor Brenton was certain. This was not hypnotism, nor did his power over the half-wit have any relation to hypnotism. For many nights, Aker was subjected to examination and new tests. Brenton dug deep and without mercy, in the hope that he might unearth the reason for the hidden phenomenon. At first there was no explanation, but he found out much during his hours of research and finally came to the most important discovery of all. It was a cold night in December, and Professor Brenton was seated in his easy-chair. That was 2 weeks after Gus Aker first appeared in his room. Suddenly, Brenton perceived that his fire was out, all that remained in the grate being some dying embers. Grumbling, he arose and slipped on his great coat, reflecting almost unconsciously, "I wish Gus would bring up some firewood." Shivering, he resumed his reading. A few minutes later there was a scraping outside his door, and Aker entered with an armload of fuel. He dropped the sticks by the fireplace and stared vacantly at the little professor. There was the usual look of dumb terror, after which his eyes grew listless, and he seemed to wonder at his surroundings. "Who told you to bring up the wood?" Brenton asked. Aker mumbled, rolling his eyes, and left the room without attempting to reply. Apparently he did not understand the question. Brenton listened to the man's retreating steps, shrugged his shoulders, and, kneeling, built a new fire. He was disturbed by this new, uncanny power, but it opened a curiously marvelous field for him. He might, after all, be able to prove his theory that the mind was never a free agent. An hour later, still deep in thought, he turned to his window overlooking a plot of ground that in summer was a rose garden. Now there was snow on the ground, the bushes that abounded being slightly tinctured in white. The professor noticed a shifty figure emerging from the shadow of the house, and moved aimlessly among the sleeping bushes with their ghostly shrouds. It was Gus Aker. Poor, hopeless, demented Gus Aker. Curious to give his power further trial, the psychologist permitted himself to wish for the presence of Gus Aker in the room with him. Almost instantly the figure below straightened, and a startled face was raised to the window before which Brenton stood. Then the man went indoors. He did not move hastily, but in his slow, shuffling manner, as if he had finished his walk in the garden and was returning to the house under a natural impulse. Brenton stood still at the window, marveling. Then the door opened, and he knew what that meant. The imbecile would do whatever the professor willed that he should do. Without the practice of hypnosis, the psychologist was able to unite his mind with the mind of Gus Aker and control his actions. All that was necessary to bring this about was the barest thought. "Why don't you knock when you come in?" Brenton demanded. Aker did not reply, but shuffled his weight from one foot to the other, then turned and left the room. But the professor had done no more than wish for his presence, and any desire that he might have had for the man to remain was only negative in value. The reaction of Gus Aker was merely positive, and very naturally so. After that, Brenton was to experience a sensation of fear. He wanted to halt the experiments, and indeed did make an attempt to do so, but found, just as he had feared, that he rapidly was coming under the influence of the mind that, one almost could say, did not exist. Yet it weakened him, sapped his energy day by day, did this mental intercourse with a vacant brain. There even were times when Brenton found it difficult to breathe, and thinking was not always easy. He began, when it was too late, to realize that he was to be penalized for his unnatural experiments. The little professor was suffering from nerves. Perhaps it was old age creeping on, he told himself, casting about for an excuse. Could it be that the imbecile was making demands upon him, eating into his brain? And then there was his vitality, now at ebb. His capacity for work had decreased, and it was difficult for him to concentrate, even on his reading. It's time I was ending this vacation, Brenton decided. I must get back to the old routine. Enough of this foolishness. But he could not leave. Very rapidly indeed his own mind and the mind of Gus Aker were merging, and his own mind, slowly, was being sucked away. All but helpless, Brenton began to be concerned for his own sanity. At last he came to fear Aker, to dread the sight of him, and yet a dozen times a day he found it necessary to call the imbecile to his room, much to the discomfort of the landlady, who was unable to understand anything that would suggest a friendship between the queer little scientist in the front room on the third floor and her witless brother. It wasn't reasonable, she interpreted. The end came at last. Brenton, suddenly aroused, sat up in the old-fashioned bed that formed no mean part of the furnishings of the room. His body was clammy, and he was gripped by a fear of the unknown. Brenton, a brave man as shown by his experiments covering many years, seemed to sense that mighty fingers were at his throat. He had been dreaming. What a dream! He had seen Gus Aker creeping up the stairs, a long kitchen knife in his hand. The half-witted creature had stood over him, and then... It had been at this point that the psychologist awoke, just as the knife was descending. A few minutes later he was calmer, and did succeed, to a degree, in putting aside his fears. He pulled the covers over his shoulders, for it was cold, and the log fire was now only so much ashes. Footsteps outside his room, boards creaking. A hand fumbled at the door. The door swung open. A shaft of moonlight penetrating the room and falling upon the figure that crouched in the doorway, just as it had been seen to do in the dream a few minutes before Brenton screamed. The thought whirled through his mind that he was helpless. The action of his dream was such that the witless man would carry it out. He was trembling, too, and his eyes burned into his head like torches that flamed in white heat. The figure crossed the floor, still crouching. There was the glitter of a long kitchen knife. Brenton's effort to gain control of the mind of Gus Aker was futile. He knew what he must do to save himself, but the mental effort that would control the man was impossible of accomplishment. He staggered like one seeking to arouse himself from a nightmare. The figure crept upon him, slowly and with a great show of stealth. The scientist could hear the man's short breathing, see the very gleam of his eyes as the moonbeam shot into his face. The boards of the floor creaked, and the sound was not like anything Brenton had ever heard before. It made him think of a bat beating its wings against the walls of a tomb. A single thought, a moment of mental action, would change the course of the half-wit's movements. But the psychologist knew that his mind had been sucked dry, and that the man creeping upon him was the one who now held the scepter of power. Anderson Brenton was the one paralyzed, and he could only watch Gus Aker approach with the long knife in his hand, the moonbeams falling upon his purple face. just as in the dream. One last scream. The next morning, the witless man was found by his sister, asleep on the floor of the front room on the third floor. There was a kitchen knife in his hand, a long knife stained with blood. Anne Brenton, who had not been able to will that Gus Aker should not carry out his unfortunate dream, was dead.
Feathertop, a Moralized Legend by Nathaniel Hawthorne. "Dickon," cried Mother Rigby, "a coal for my pipe." The pipe was in the old dame's mouth when she said these words. She had thrust it there after filling it with tobacco, but without stooping to light it at the hearth, where indeed there was no appearance of a fire having been kindled that morning. Forthwith, however, as soon as the order was given, there was an intense red glow out of the bowl of the pipe, and a whiff of smoke came from Mother Rigby's lips. Whence the coal came, and how brought thither by an invisible hand, I have never been able to discover. "Good," quoth Mother Rigby with a nod of her hand. "Thank ye, Dickon. And now for making this scarecrow. Be within call, Dickon, in case I need you again." The good woman had risen thus early, for as yet it was scarcely sunrise, in order to set about making a scarecrow, which she intended to put in the middle of her corn patch. It was now the latter week of May, and the crows and blackbirds had already discovered the little green rolled-up leaf of the Indian corn just peeping out of the soil. She was determined, therefore, to contrive as lifelike a scarecrow as ever was seen, and to finish it immediately from top to toe, so that it should begin its sentinel's duty that very morning. Now Mother Rigby, as everybody must have heard, was one of the most cunning and potent witches in New England, and might, with very little trouble, have made a scarecrow ugly enough to frighten the minister himself. But on this occasion, as she had awakened in an uncommonly pleasant humor, and was further dulcified by her pipe tobacco, she resolved to produce something fine, beautiful, and splendid, rather than hideous and horrible. "I don't want to set up a hobgoblin in my corn patch, and almost at my own doorstep," said Mother Rigby to herself, puffing out a whiff of smoke. "I could do it if I pleased, but I'm tired of doing marvelous things, and so I'll keep within the bounds of everyday business just for variety's sake. Besides, there's no use in scaring the little children for a mile round about, though 'tis true I'm a witch." It was settled, therefore, in her own mind, that the scarecrow should represent a fine gentleman of the period, so far as the materials at hand would allow. Perhaps it may be as well to enumerate the chief of the articles that went to the composition of this figure. The most important item of all, probably, although it made so little show, was a certain broomstick, on which Mother Rigby had taken many an airy gallop at midnight, and which now served the scarecrow by way of a spinal column, or, as the unlearned phrase it, a backbone. One of its arms was a disabled flail which used to be wielded by Goodman Rigby, before his spouse worried him out of this troublesome world. The other, if I mistake not, was composed of the pudding-stick and a broken rung of a chair, tied loosely together at the elbow. As for its legs, the right was a hoe-handle, and the left an undistinguished and miscellaneous stick from the wood-pile. Its lungs, stomach, and other affairs of that kind were nothing better than a meal-bag stuffed with straw. Thus we have made out the skeleton and entire corporosity of the scarecrow, with the exception of its head, and this was admirably supplied by a somewhat withered and shriveled pumpkin, in which Mother Rigby cut 2 holes for the eyes and a slit for the mouth, leaving a bluish-colored knob in the middle to pass for a nose. It was quite a respectable face. "I've seen worse ones on human shoulders, at any rate," said Mother Rigby, "and many a fine gentleman has a pumpkin head as well as my scarecrow." But the clothes, in this case, were to be the making of the man. So the good old woman took down from a peg an ancient plum-colored coat of London make, and with relics of embroidery on its seams, cuffs, pocket-flaps, and button-holes, but lamentably worn and faded, patched at the elbows, tattered at the skirts, and threadbare all over. On the left breast was a round hole, whence either a star of nobility had been rent away, or else the hot heart of some former wearer had scorched it through and through. The neighbors said that this rich garment belonged to the black man's wardrobe, and that he kept it at Mother Rigby's cottage for the convenience of slipping it on whenever he wished to make a grand appearance at the governor's table. To match the coat there was a velvet waistcoat of very ample size, and formerly embroidered with foliage that had been as brightly golden as the maple leaves in October, but which had now quite vanished out of the substance of the velvet. Next came a pair of scarlet breeches once worn by the French governor of Louisbourg, and the knees of which had touched the lower step of the throne of Louis le Grand. The Frenchman had given these small clothes to an Indian powwow, who parted with them to the old witch for a gill of strong waters, at one of their dances in the forest. Furthermore, Mother Rigby produced a pair of silk stockings and put them on the figure's legs, where they showed as unsubstantial as a dream, with the wooden reality of the two sticks making itself miserably apparent through the holes. Lastly, she put her dead husband's wig on the bare scalp of the pumpkin, and surmounted the whole with a dusty three-cornered hat, in which was stuck the longest tail feather of a rooster. Then the old dame stood the figure up in a corner of her cottage, and chuckled to behold its yellow semblance of a visage, with its knobby little nose thrust into the air. It had a strangely self-satisfied aspect, and seemed to say, "Come look at me." "And you're well worth looking at, that's a fact," quoth Mother Rigby, in admiration at her own handiwork. "I've made many a puppet since I've been a witch, but methinks this is the finest of them all. 'Tis almost too good for a scarecrow. And by the by, I'll just fill a fresh pipe of tobacco, and then take him out to the corn-patch." While filling her pipe, the old woman continued to gaze with almost motherly affection at the figure in the corner. To say the truth, whether it were chance or skill or downright witchcraft, there was something wonderfully human in this ridiculous shape, bedizened with its tattered finery. And as for the countenance, it appeared to shrivel its yellow surface into a grin, a funny sort of expression betwixt scorn and merriment, as if it understood itself to be a jest at mankind. The more Mother Rigby looked, the better she was pleased. "Dickon!" cried she sharply, "another coal for my pipe." Hardly had she spoken than, just as before, there was a red glowing coal on the top of the tobacco. She drew in a long whiff and puffed it forth again into the bar of morning sunshine which struggled through the one dusty pane of her cottage window. Mother Rigby always liked to flavor her pipe with a coal of fire from the particular chimney corner whence this had been brought. But where that chimney corner might be, or who brought the coal from it, further than that the invisible messenger seemed to respond to the name of Dickon, I cannot tell. "That puppet yonder," thought Mother Rigby, still with her eyes fixed on the scarecrow, "is too good a piece of work to stand all summer in a corn-patch, frightening away the crows and blackbirds. He's capable of better things. Why, I've danced with a worse one, when partners happen to be scarce, at our witch meetings in the forest. What if I should let him take his chance among the other men of straw and empty fellows who go bustling about the world?" The old witch took 3 or 4 more whiffs of her pipe and smiled. "He'll meet plenty of his brethren at every street corner," continued she. "Well, I didn't mean to dabble in witchcraft today, further than the lighting of my pipe, but a witch I am, and a witch I'm likely to be, and there's no use trying to shirk it. I'll make a man of my scarecrow, were it only for the joke's sake." While muttering these words, Mother Rigby took the pipe from her own mouth and thrust it into the crevice which represented the same feature in the pumpkin visage of the scarecrow. "Puff, darling, puff," said she. "Puff away, my fine fellow. Your life depends on it." This was a strange exhortation, undoubtedly to be addressed to a mere thing of sticks, straw, and old clothes, with nothing better than a shriveled pumpkin for a head. as we know to have been the Scarecrow's case. Nevertheless, as we must carefully hold in remembrance, Mother Rigby was a witch of singular power and dexterity, and keeping this fact duly before our minds, we shall see nothing beyond credibility in the remarkable incidents of our story. Indeed, the great difficulty will be at once got over if we can only bring ourselves to believe that as soon as the old dame bade him puff, there came a whiff of smoke from the Scarecrow's mouth. It was the very feeblest of whiffs, to be sure, but it was followed by another and another, each more decided than the preceding one. "Puff away, my pet, puff away, my pretty one," Mother Rigby kept repeating with her pleasantest smile. "It is the breath of life to ye, and that you may take my word for." Beyond all question, the pipe was bewitched. There must have been a spell either in the tobacco or in the fiercely glowing coal that so mysteriously burned on top of it, or in the pungently aromatic smoke which exhaled from the kindled weed. The figure, after a few doubtful attempts at length, blew forth a volley of smoke extending all the way from the obscure corner into the bar of sunshine. There it eddied and melted away among the motes of dust. It seemed a convulsive effort, for the 2 or 3 next whiffs were fainter, although the coal still glowed and threw a gleam over the Scarecrow's visage. The old witch clapped her skinny hands together, and she smiled encouragingly upon her handiwork. She saw that the charm worked well. The shriveled yellow face, which heretofore had been no face at all, had already a thin, fantastic haze, as if it were of human likeness, shifting to and fro across it, sometimes vanishing entirely, but growing more perceptible than ever with the next whiff from the pipe. The whole figure in like manner assumed a show of life, such as we impart to ill-defined shapes among the clouds, and half deceive ourselves with the pastime of our own fancy. If we must needs pry closely into the matter, it may be doubted whether there was any real change, after all, in the sordid, worn-out, worthless, and ill-jointed substance of the Scarecrow, but merely a spectral illusion, and a cunning effect of light and shade so colored and contrived as to delude the eyes of most men. The miracles of witchcraft seem always to have had a very shallow subtlety, and at least, if the above explanation do not hit the truth of the process, I can suggest no better. "Well puffed, my pretty lad," still cried old Mother Rigby. "Come, another good stout whiff, and let it be with might and main. Puff for thy life, I tell thee. Puff out of the very bottom of thy heart, if any heart thou hast, or any bottom to it. Well done, again, thou didst suck in that mouthful as if for the pure love of it." And then the witch beckoned to the Scarecrow, throwing so much magnetic potency into her gesture that it seemed as if it must inevitably be obeyed, like the mystic call of the lodestone when it summons the iron. "Why lurkest thou in the corner, lazy one?" said she. "Step forth, thou hast the world before thee." Upon my word, if the legend were not one which I heard on my grandmother's knee, and which had established its place among things credible before my childish judgment could analyze its probability, I question whether I should have the face to tell it now. In obedience to Mother Rigby's word, and extending its arm as if to reach her outstretched hand, the figure made a step forward, a kind of hitch and jerk, however, rather than a step, then tottered and almost lost its balance. What could the witch expect? It was nothing, after all, but a scarecrow stuck upon 2 sticks. But the strong-willed old beldam scowled and beckoned and flung the energy of her purpose so forcibly at this poor combination of rotten wood and musty straw and ragged garments, that it was compelled to show itself a man in spite of the reality of things. So it stepped into the bar of sunshine. There it stood, poor devil of a contrivance that it was, with only the thinnest vesture of human similitude about it, through which was evident the stiff, rickety, incongruous, faded, tattered, good-for-nothing patchwork of its substance, ready to sink in a heap upon the floor, as conscious of its own unworthiness to be erect. Shall I confess the truth? At its present point of vivification, The Scarecrow reminds me of some of the lukewarm and abortive characters, composed of heterogeneous materials, used for the thousandth time and never worth using, with which romance writers, and myself no doubt among the rest, have so overpeopled the world of fiction. But the fierce old hag began to get angry and show a glimpse of her diabolic nature, like a snake's head, peeping with a hiss out of her bosom. At this pusillanimous behavior of the thing, which she had taken the trouble to put together. "Puff away, wretch!" cried she wrathfully. "Puff, puff, puff, thou thing of straw and emptiness! Thou rag or two, thou meal bag, thou pumpkin head, thou nothing! Where shall I find a name vile enough to call thee by? Puff, I say, and suck in thy fantastic life with the smoke, else I snatch the pipe from thy mouth and hurl thee where that red coal came from." Thus threatened, the unhappy Scarecrow had nothing for it but to puff away for dear life. As need was, therefore, it applied itself lustily to the pipe and sent forth such abundant volleys of tobacco smoke that the small cottage kitchen became all vaporous. The one sunbeam struggled mistily through and could but imperfectly define the image of the cracked and dusty window-pane on the opposite wall. Mother Rigby, meanwhile, with one brown arm akimbo and the other stretched towards the figure, loomed grimly amid the obscurity with such port and expression as when she was wont to leave a ponderous nightmare on her victims and stand at the bedside to enjoy their agony. In fear and trembling did this poor Scarecrow puff. But its efforts, it must be acknowledged, served an excellent purpose, for with each successive whiff the figure lost more and more of its dizzy and perplexing tenuity, and seemed to take denser substance. Its very garments, moreover, partook of the magical change, and shone with the gloss of novelty, and glistened with the skilfully embroidered gold that had long ago been rent away, and half revealed among the smoke. The yellow visage bent its lustreless eyes on Mother Rigby. At last the old witch clenched her fist and shook it at the figure. Not that she was positively angry, but merely acting on the principle, perhaps untrue, or not the only truth, though as high a one as Mother Rigby could be expected to attain, that feeble and torpid natures, being incapable of better inspiration, must be stirred up by fear. But here was the crisis. Should she fail in what she now sought to effect, it was her ruthless purpose to scatter the miserable simulacre into its original elements. "Thou hast a man's aspect," said she sternly. "Have also the echo and mockery of a voice. I bid thee speak." The Scarecrow gasped, struggled, and at length emitted a murmur, which was so incorporated with his smoky breath that you could scarcely tell whether it were indeed a voice, or only a whiff of tobacco. Some narrators of this legend hold the opinion that Mother Rigby's conjurations and the fierceness of her will had compelled a familiar spirit into the figure, and that the voice was his. "Mother," mumbled the poor stifled voice, "be not so awful with me. I would fain speak, but being without wits, what can I say?" "Thou canst speak, darling, canst thou?" cried Mother Rigby, relaxing her grim countenance into a smile. "And what shalt thou say, quotha? Say indeed. Art thou of the brotherhood of the empty skull, and demandest of me what thou shalt say? Thou shalt say 1,000 things, and saying them 1,000 times over, thou shalt still have said nothing. Be not afraid, I tell thee. When thou comest into the world, whither I purpose sending thee forthwith, thou shalt not lack the wherewithal to talk. Talk! Why, thou shalt babble like a mill-stream if thou wilt. Thou hast brains enough for that, I trow." "At your service, mother," responded the figure. "And that was well said, my pretty one," answered Mother Rigby. "Then thou speakest like myself, and mean nothing. Thou shalt have 100 such set phrases, and 500 to the boot of them. And now, darling, I have taken so much pains with thee, and thou art so beautiful, that, by my troth, I love thee better than any witch's puppet in the world. And I made them of all sorts, clay, wax, straw, sticks, night fog, morning mist, sea foam, and chimney smoke. But thou art the very best, so give heed to what I say." "Yes, kind mother," said the figure, "with all my heart." "With all thy heart," cried the old witch, setting her hands to her sides and laughing loudly. "Thou hast such a pretty way of speaking, with all thy heart, and thou didst put thy hand to the left side of thy waistcoat, as if thou really hadst one." So now, in high good humor with this fantastic contrivance of hers, Mother Rigby told the Scarecrow that it must go and play its part in the great world, where not one man in 100, she affirmed, was gifted with more real substance than itself, and that he might hold up his head with the best of them. She endowed him, on the spot, with an unreckonable amount of wealth. It consisted partly of a gold mine in El Dorado, and of 10,000 shares in a broken bubble, and of 500,000 acres of vineyard at the North Pole, and of a castle in the air and a chateau in Spain, together with all the rents and income therefrom accruing. She further made over to him the cargo of a certain ship, laden with the salt of Cadiz, which she herself, by her necromantic arts, had caused to founder 10 years before in the deepest part of mid-ocean. If the salt were not dissolved, and could be brought to market, it would fetch a pretty penny among the fishermen. That he might not lack ready money, she gave him a copper farthing of Birmingham manufacture, being all the coin she had about her, and likewise a great deal of brass, which she applied to his forehead, thus making it yellower than ever. "With that brass alone," quoth Mother Rigby, "thou canst pay thy way all over the earth. Kiss me, pretty darling, I have done my best for thee." Furthermore, that the adventurer might lack no possible advantage towards a fair start in life, this excellent old dame gave him a token by which he was to introduce himself to a certain magistrate, member of the council, merchant, and elder of the church, the 4 capacities constituting but one man, who stood at the head of society in the neighboring metropolis. The token was neither more nor less than a single word, which Mother Rigby whispered to the Scarecrow, and which the Scarecrow was to whisper to the merchant. "Gouty as the old fellow is, he'll run thy errands for thee, when once thou hast given him that word in his ear," said the old witch. "Mother Rigby knows the worshipful Justice Gookin, and the worshipful Justice knows Mother Rigby." Here the witch thrust her wrinkled face close to the puppet's, chuckling irrepressibly, and fidgeting all through her system with delight at the idea which she meant to communicate. "Worshipful Master Gookin," whispered she, "hath a comely maiden to his daughter, and hark ye, my pet, thou hast a fair outside, and a pretty wit enough of thine own, yea, a pretty wit enough. Thou wilt think better of it when thou hast seen more of other people's wits. Now, with thy outside and thy inside, thou art the very man to win a young girl's heart. Never doubt it. I tell thee it shall be so. Put but a bold face on the matter, sigh, smile, flourish thy hat, thrust forth thy leg like a dancing master, put thy right hand to the left side of thy waistcoat, and pretty Polly Gookin is thine own." All this while the new creature had been sucking in and exhaling the vapory fragrance of his pipe, and seemed now to continue this occupation as much for the enjoyment it afforded as because it was an essential condition of his existence. It was wonderful to see how exceedingly like a human being it behaved. Its eyes, for it appeared to possess a pair, were bent on Mother Rigby, and at suitable junctures it nodded or shook its head. Neither did it lack words proper for the occasion. "Really, indeed, pray tell me, is it possible? Upon my word, by no means. Oh, ah, hem," and other such weighty utterances as imply attention, inquiry, acquiescence, or dissent on the part of the auditor. Even had you stood by and seen the Scarecrow made, you could scarcely have resisted the conviction that it perfectly understood the cunning counsels which the old witch poured into its counterfeit of an ear. The more earnestly it applied its lips to the pipe, the more distinctly was its human likeness stamped upon visible realities, the more sagacious grew its expression, the more lifelike its gestures and movements, and the more intelligibly audible its voice. Its garments, too, glistened so much the brighter with an illusory magnificence. The very pipe in which burned the spell of all this wonder-work ceased to appear as a smoke-blackened earthen stump, and became a meerschaum, with painted bowl and amber mouthpiece. It might be apprehended, however, that as the life of an illusion seemed identical with the vapor of the pipe, it would terminate simultaneously with the reduction of the tobacco to ashes. But the beldame foresaw the difficulty. "Hold thou the pipe, my precious one," said she, "while I fill it for thee again." It was sorrowful to behold how the fine gentleman began to fade back into a scarecrow, while Mother Rigby shook the ashes out of the pipe and proceeded to replenish it from her tobacco box. "Dickon," cried she in her high, sharp tone, "another coal for this pipe." No sooner said than the intensely red speck of fire was glowing within the pipe bowl, and the scarecrow, without waiting for the witch's bidding, applied the tube to his lips and drew in a few short, convulsive whiffs, which soon, however, became regular and equable. "Now, mine own heart's darling," quoth Mother Rigby, "whatever may happen to thee, thou must stick to thy pipe. Thy life is in it, and that, at least, thou knowest well, if thou knowest naught besides. Stick to thy pipe, I say. Smoke, puff, blow thy cloud, and tell the people, if any question be made, that it is for thy health, and that so the physician orders thee to do. And, sweet one, when thou shalt find thy pipe getting low, go apart into some corner, and, first filling thyself with smoke, cry sharply, 'Dickon, a fresh pipe of tobacco,' and 'Dickon, another coal for my pipe,' and have it in thy pretty mouth as speedily as may be. Else, instead of a gallant gentleman in a gold-laced coat, thou wilt be but a jumble of sticks and tattered clothes, and a bag of straw, and a withered pumpkin. Now depart, my treasure, and good luck go with thee." "Never fear, mother," said the figure in a stout voice, and sending forth a courageous whiff of smoke. "I will thrive, if an honest man and a gentleman may." "Oh, thou wilt be the death of me," cried the old witch, convulsed with laughter. "That was well said. If an honest man and a gentleman may. Thou playest thy part to perfection. Get along with thee for a smart fellow, and I will wager on thy head as a man of pith and substance, with a brain and what they call a heart, and all else that a man should have against any other thing on two legs. I hold myself a better witch than yesterday for thy sake. Did not I make thee? And I defy any witch in New England to make such another. Here, take my staff along with thee." The staff, though it was but a plain oaken stick, immediately took the aspect of a gold-headed cane. "That gold head has as much sense in it as thine own," said Mother Rigby, "and it will guide thee straight to the worshipful Master Gookin's door. Get thee gone, my pretty pet, my darling, my precious one, my treasure, and if any ask thy name, it is Feathertop, for thou hast a feather in thy hat, and I have thrust a handful of feathers into the hollow of thy head, and thy wig, too, is of the fashion they call Feathertop. So be Feathertop thy name." And issuing from the cottage, Feathertop strode manfully towards town. Mother Rigby stood at the threshold, well pleased to see how the sunbeams glistened on him, as if all his magnificence were real, and how diligently and lovingly he smoked his pipe, and how handsomely he walked in spite of a little stiffness of his legs. She watched him until out of sight, and threw a witch benediction after her darling, when a turn of the road snatched him from her view. Betimes in the forenoon, when the principal street of the neighboring town was just at its acme of life and bustle, a stranger of very distinguished figure was seen on the sidewalk. His port, as well as his garments, betokened nothing short of nobility. He wore a richly embroidered plum-colored coat, a waistcoat of costly velvet magnificently adorned with golden foliage, a pair of splendid scarlet breeches, and the finest and glossiest of white silk stockings. His head was covered with a peruke so daintily powdered and adjusted that it would have been sacrilege to disorder it with a hat, which therefore, and it was a gold-laced hat, set off with a snowy feather he carried beneath his arm. On the breast of his coat glistened a star. He managed his gold-headed cane with an airy grace peculiar to the fine gentleman of the period, and to give the highest possible finish to his equipment, he had lace ruffles at his wrist of a most ethereal delicacy, sufficiently avouching how idle and aristocratic must be the hands which they have concealed. It was a remarkable point in the accoutrement of this brilliant personage that he held in his left hand a fantastic kind of a pipe, with an exquisitely painted bowl and an amber mouthpiece. This he applied to his lips as often as every 5 or 6 paces, and inhaled a deep whiff of smoke, which, after being retained a moment in his lungs, might be seen to eddy gracefully from his mouth and nostrils. As may well be supposed, the street was all astir to find out the stranger's name. "It is some great nobleman, beyond question," said one of the townspeople. "Do you see the star at his breast?" "Nay, it is too bright to be seen," said another. "Yes, he must needs be a nobleman, as you say. But by what conveyance, think you? Can his lordship have voyaged or travelled hither?" "There has been no vessel from the old country for a month past." "And if he have arrived overland from the southward, pray, where are his attendants and equipage?" "He needs no equipage to set off his rank," remarked a third. "If he came among us in rags, nobility would shine through a hole in his elbow. I never saw such dignity of aspect. He has the old Norman blood in his veins, I warrant him." "I rather take him to be a Dutchman or one of your High Germans," said another citizen. "The men of those countries have always the pipe at their mouths." "And so has a Turk," answered his companion. "But in my judgment this stranger hath been bred at the French court, and hath there learned politeness and grace of manner, which none understands so well as the nobility of France. That gait, now, a vulgar spectator might deem it stiff. He might call it a hitch and jerk, but to my eye it hath an unspeakable majesty. It must have been acquired by constant observation of the deportment of the grand monarch. The stranger's character and office are evident enough. He is a French ambassador, come to treat with our rulers about the cession of Canada." "More probably a Spaniard," said another, "and hence his yellow complexion, or most likely he is from the Havana, or from some port on the Spanish Main, and comes to make investigation about the piracies which our government is thought to connive at. Those settlers in Peru and Mexico have skins as yellow as the gold which they dig out of their mines." "Yellow or not," cried a lady, "he is a beautiful man. So tall, so slender, such a fine, noble face, with so well-shaped a nose, and all the delicacy of expression about the mouth. Bless me, how bright his star is! It positively shoots out flames." "So do your eyes, fair lady," said the stranger, with a bow and a flourish of his pipe, for he was just passing at the instant. "Upon my honor, they have quite dazzled me." "Was ever so original and exquisite a compliment?" murmured the lady in an ecstasy of delight. Amid the general admiration excited by the stranger's appearance, there were only 2 dissenting voices. One was that of an impertinent cur, which, after snuffing at the heels of the glistening figure, put its tail between its legs and skulked into its master's backyard, vociferating in an execrable howl. The other dissentient was a young child, who squalled at the fullest stretch of his lungs, and babbled some unintelligible nonsense about a pumpkin. Feathertop, meanwhile, pursued his way along the street. Except for the few complimentary words to the lady, and now and then a slight inclination of the head in requital of the profound reverences of the bystanders, he seemed wholly absorbed in his pipe. There needed no other proof of his rank and consequence than the perfect equanimity with which he comported himself, while the curiosity and admiration of the town swelled almost into clamor around him, With the crowd gathering behind his footsteps, he finally reached the mansion house of the worshipful Justice Gookin, entered the gate, ascended the steps of the front door, and knocked. In the interim, before his summons was answered, the stranger was observed to shake the ashes out of his pipe. "What did he say in that sharp voice?" inquired one of the spectators. "Nay, I know not," answered his friend, "but the sun dazzles my eyes strangely. How dim and faded his lordship looks all of a sudden! Bless my wits, what is the matter with me?" "The wonder is," said the other, "that his pipe, which was out only an instant ago, should be all alight again and with the reddest coal I ever saw. There is something mysterious about this stranger. What a whiff of smoke was that! Dim and faded, did you call him? Why, as he turns about, the star on his breast is still ablaze." "It is indeed," said his companion, "and it will go near to dazzle pretty Polly Gookin, whom I see peeping at it out of the chamber window." The door being now opened, Feathertop turned to the crowd, made a stately bend of his body like a great man acknowledging the reverence of the meaner sort, and vanished into the house. There was a mysterious kind of a smile, if it might not better be called a grin or grimace, upon his visage. But of all the throng that beheld him, not an individual appears to have possessed insight enough to detect the elusive character of the stranger except a little child and a cur dog. Our legend here loses somewhat of its continuity, and, passing over the preliminary explanation between Feathertop and the merchant, goes in quest of the pretty Polly Gookin. She was a damsel of a soft round figure, with light hair and blue eyes, and a fair rosy face, which seemed neither very shrewd nor very simple. This young lady had caught a glimpse of the glistening stranger while standing on the threshold, and had forthwith put on a laced cap, a string of beads, her finest kerchief, and her stiffest damask petticoat in preparation for the interview. Hurrying from her chamber to the parlor, she had ever since been viewing herself in the large looking-glass, and practising pretty airs, now a smile, now a ceremonious dignity of aspect, and now a softer smile than the former, kissing her hand likewise, tossing her head, and managing her fan, while within the mirror an unsubstantial little maid repeated every gesture and did all the foolish things that Polly did, but without making her ashamed of them. In short, it was the fault of pretty Polly's ability rather than her will if she failed to be as complete an artifice as the illustrious Feathertop himself, and when she thus tampered with her own simplicity, the witch's phantom might well hope to win her. No sooner did Polly hear her father's gouty footsteps approaching the parlor door, accompanied with the stiff clatter of Feathertop's high-heeled shoes, than she seated herself bolt upright and innocently began warbling a song. "Polly, daughter Polly," cried the old merchant, "come hither, child." Master Gookin's aspect, as he opened the door, was doubtful and troubled. "This gentleman," continued he, presenting the stranger, "is the Chevalier Feathertop, nay, I beg his pardon, my Lord Feathertop, who hath brought me a token of remembrance from an ancient friend of mine. Pay your duty to his lordship, child, and honor him as his quality deserves." After these few words of introduction, the worshipful magistrate immediately quitted the room. But even in that brief moment, had the fair Polly glanced aside at her father instead of devoting herself wholly to the brilliant guest, she might have taken warning of some mischief nigh at hand. The old man was nervous, fidgety, and very pale. Purposing a smile of courtesy, he had deformed his face with a sort of galvanic grin, which, when Feathertop's back was turned, he exchanged for a scowl, at the same time shaking his fist and stamping his gouty foot, an incivility which brought its retribution along with it. The truth appears to have been that Mother Rigby's word of introduction, whatever it might be, had operated far more on the rich merchant's fears than on his good will. Moreover, being a man of wonderfully acute observation, he had noticed that these painted figures on the bowl of Feathertop's pipe were in motion. Looking more closely, he became convinced that these figures were a party of little demons, each duly provided with horns and a tail, and dancing hand in hand, with gestures of diabolical merriment, round the circumference of the pipe bowl. As if to confirm his suspicions, while Master Gookin ushered his guest along a dusky passage from his private room to the parlor, The star on Feathertop's breast had scintillated actual flames, and threw a flickering gleam upon the wall, the ceiling, and the floor, with such sinister prognostics manifesting themselves on all hands. It is not to be marveled at that the merchant should have felt that he was committing his daughter to a very questionable acquaintance. He cursed in his secret soul the insinuating elegance of Feathertop's manners, as this brilliant personage bowed, smiled, put his hand on his heart, inhaled a long whiff from his pipe, and enriched the atmosphere with the smoky vapor of a fragrant invisible sigh. Gladly would poor Master Gookin have thrust his dangerous guest into the street, but there was a constraint and terror within him. This respectable old gentleman, we fear, at an earlier period of life, had given some pledge or other to the evil principle, and perhaps was now to redeem it by the sacrifice of his daughter. It so happened that the parlor door was partly of glass, shaded by a silken curtain, the folds of which hung a little awry. So strong was the merchant's interest in witnessing what was to ensue between the fair Polly and the gallant Feathertop, that after quitting the room he could by no means refrain from peeping through the crevice of the curtain. There was nothing very miraculous to be seen, nothing except the trifles previously noticed, to confirm the idea of a supernatural peril environing the pretty Polly. The stranger, it is true, was evidently a thorough and practised man of the world, systematic and self-possessed, and therefore the sort of person to whom a parent ought not to confide a simple young girl without due watchfulness for the result. The worthy magistrate, who had been conversant with all degrees and qualities of mankind, could not but perceive every motion and gesture of the distinguished Feathertop came in its proper place. Nothing had been left rude or native in him. A well-digested conventionalism had incorporated itself thoroughly with his substance and transformed him into a work of art. Perhaps it was this peculiarity that invested him with a species of ghastliness and awe. It is the effect of anything completely and consummately artificial in human shape, that the person impresses us as an unreality, and as having hardly pith enough to cast a shadow upon the floor. As regarded Feathertop, all this resulted in a wild, extravagant, and fantastical impression, as if his life and being were akin to the smoke that curled upward from his pipe. But pretty Polly Gookin felt not thus. The pair was now promenading the room. Feathertop with his dainty stride and no less dainty grimace, the girl with a native maidenly grace just touched, not spoiled, by a slightly affected manner which seemed caught from the perfect artifice of her companion. The longer the interview continued, the more charmed was pretty Polly, until, within the first quarter of an hour, as the old magistrate noted by his watch, she was evidently beginning to be in love. Nor need it have been witchcraft that subdued her in such a hurry. The poor child's heart, it may be, was so very fervent that it melted her with its own warmth, as reflected from the hollow semblance of a lover. No matter what Feathertop said, his words found depth and reverberation in her ear. No matter what he did, his action was heroic to her eye, and by this time it is to be supposed there was a blush on Polly's cheek, a tender smile about her mouth, and a liquid softness in her glance, while the star kept coruscating on Feathertop's breast, and the little demons careered with more frantic merriment than ever about the circumference of his pipe bowl. Oh, pretty Polly Gookin! Why should these imps rejoice so madly that a silly maiden's heart was about to be given to a shadow? Is it so unusual a misfortune, so rare a triumph? By and by Feathertop paused, and throwing himself into an imposing attitude, seemed to summon the fair girl to survey his figure and resist him longer if she could. His star, his embroidery, his buckles glowed at that instant with unutterable splendor. The picturesque hues of his attire took a richer depth of coloring. There was a gleam and polish over his whole presence, betokening the perfect witchery of well-ordered manners. The maiden raised her eyes and suffered them to linger upon her companion with a bashful and admiring gaze. Then, as if desirous of judging what value her own simple comeliness might have side by side with so much brilliancy, She cast a glance towards the full-length looking-glass in front of which they happened to be standing. It was one of the truest plates in the world, and incapable of flattery. No sooner did the images therein reflected meet Polly's eye than she shrieked, shrank from the stranger's side, gazed at him for a moment in the wildest dismay, and sank insensible upon the floor. Feathertop, likewise, had looked towards the mirror, and there beheld, not the glittering mockery of his outside show, but a picture of the sordid patchwork of his real composition, stripped of all witchcraft. The wretched simulacrum. We almost pity him. He threw up his arms with an expression of despair that went further than any of his previous manifestations towards vindicating his claims to be reckoned human. For perchance the only time since this so often empty and deceptive life of mortals began its course, an illusion had seen and fully recognized itself. Mother Rigby was seated by her kitchen hearth in the twilight of this eventful day, and had just shaken the ashes out of a new pipe, when she heard a hurried tramp along the road. Yet it did not seem so much the tramp of human footsteps as the clatter of sticks or the rattling of dry bones. "Ha!" thought the old witch. "What step is that? Whose skeleton is out of its grave now, I wonder?" A figure burst headlong into the cottage door. It was Feathertop. His pipe was still alight. The star still flamed upon his breast. The embroidery still glowed upon his garments. Nor had he lost in any degree or manner that could be estimated the aspect that assimilated him with our mortal brotherhood. But yet, in some indescribable way, as is the case with all that has deluded us when once found out, the poor reality was felt beneath the cunning artifice. "What has gone wrong?" demanded the witch. "Did yonder sniffling hypocrite thrust my darling from his door? The villain! I'll set 20 fiends to torment him till he offer thee his daughter on his bended knees." "No, mother," said Feathertop despondingly. "It was not that." "Did the girl scorn my precious one?" asked Mother Rigby, her fierce eyes glowing like 2 coals of Tophet. "I'll cover her face with pimples. Her nose shall be as red as the coal on thy pipe. Her front teeth shall drop out. In a week hence she shall not be worth thy having." "Let her alone, mother," answered poor Feathertop. "The girl was half won, and methinks a kiss from her sweet lips might have made me altogether human. But," he added after a brief pause and then a howl of self-contempt, "I've seen myself, mother. I've seen myself of the wretched, ragged, empty thing I am. I'll exist no longer." Snatching the pipe from his mouth, he flung it with all his might against the chimney, and at the same instant sank upon the floor a medley of straw and tattered garments, with some sticks protruding from the heap, and a shriveled pumpkin in the midst. The eye-holes were now lustreless, but the rudely carved gap, that just before had been a mouth, still seemed to twist itself into a despairing grin, and was so far human. "Poor fellow!" quoth Mother Rigby, with a rueful glance at the relics of her ill-fated contrivance. "My poor dear pretty Feathertop! There are thousands upon thousands of coxcombs and charlatans in the world, made up of just such a jumble of worn-out, forgotten, and good-for-nothing trash as he was. Yet they live in fair repute, and never see themselves for what they are. But why should my poor puppet be the only one to know himself and perish for it?" While thus muttering, the witch had filled a fresh pipe of tobacco and held the stem between her fingers, as doubtful whether to thrust it into her own mouth or Feathertop's. "Poor Feathertop," she continued. "I could easily give him another chance and send him forth again tomorrow. But no, his feelings are too tender, his sensibilities too deep. He seems to have too much heart to bustle for his own advantage in such an empty and heartless world. Well, well, I'll make a scarecrow of him after all. 'Tis an innocent and useful vocation, and will suit my darling well. And if each of his human brethren had as fit a one, 'twould be the better for mankind.